Deep within the ancient halls of Solomon's palace, where wisdom once echoed through marble corridors and gold gleamed from every surface, a darker truth lurked in the shadows. The wisest king who ever lived, blessed with divine insight and unmatched understanding, had bound demons to his will and commanded supernatural forces to build the most magnificent temple the world had ever seen. But among all the entities he conquered, one figure stands out from the rest. A queen whose beauty was matched only by her cunning, whose wisdom rivaled even Solomon's own, and whose ultimate fate would shake the very foundations of the spiritual realm. This is not just another tale of biblical royalty. This is the hidden story of Solomon's demon queen, a narrative so profound and disturbing that it has been whispered in shadows for thousands of years. What really happened to the Queen of Sheba after her legendary visit to Jerusalem? Was she truly the wise and wealthy ruler described in Scripture? Or was there something far more sinister beneath her radiant exterior? And if the ancient texts are to be believed, her transformation from honored guest to bound demon reveals secrets about power, corruption, and divine justice that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous encounters. The truth about her fate after the fall is more shocking than you could imagine. She didn't simply return to her kingdom in the south. She didn't fade into historical obscurity. Instead, according to centuries of mystical tradition and forbidden texts, she underwent a transformation so complete and terrifying that it would forever change how we understand the spiritual forces that shaped Solomon's reign and ultimately led to his downfall. If you're ready to uncover the hidden truth behind one of the Bible's most mysterious figures, type 777 in the comments below and prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows of ancient wisdom. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, because what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you've been taught about the biblical narrative. This isn't just history. This is prophecy, mystery, and warning, all woven together in a tapestry that connects the ancient world to our modern spiritual battles. Let's begin this descent into the forgotten chapters of Solomon's reign, where beauty masked horror, where wisdom became deception, and where a queen's pride would seal her fate for eternity. In the annals of biblical history, few encounters have captured the imagination quite like the meeting between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Scripture tells us of her arrival in Jerusalem with a caravan bearing gold, precious stones, and exotic spices, her heart filled with hard questions designed to test the legendary wisdom of Israel's king. She had heard the reports spreading across the ancient world about Solomon's unparalleled understanding, his ability to solve any riddle, his mastery over both the natural and supernatural realms. But what if everything we've been told about this encounter is merely the surface of a far deeper and more disturbing truth? What if the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon's court was not simply a diplomatic mission or an intellectual curiosity, but the opening move in a cosmic chess game that would determine the fate of kingdoms both earthly and spiritual? The biblical account in 1 Kings presents her as genuinely impressed by Solomon's wisdom and the magnificence of his court. She declares that not even half of what she had heard could compare to what she witnessed with her own eyes. She blesses the God of Israel and departs, seemingly satisfied and enriched by the encounter. The Chronicles echo this narrative, painting a picture of mutual respect and beneficial exchange between two powerful rulers. Yet beneath this pleasant veneer, ancient mystical traditions preserved a far more complex and troubling story. These texts, passed down through generations of scholars and mystics, reveal that the Queen of Sheba was not merely testing Solomon's wisdom. She was probing for weaknesses. She was searching for the source of his power. And most disturbing of all, she may not have been entirely human to begin with. The Targum of Job, one of the earliest Jewish commentaries to hint at this darker truth, makes a startling identification. It suggests that the Queen of Sheba was none other than Lilith herself, the primordial daemoness who had rebelled against divine authority since the very beginning of creation. This wasn't mere speculation or folklore embellishment. This was a theological bombshell that reframed the entire encounter between Solomon and his mysterious visitor. Think about the implications of this revelation. If the Queen of Sheba was indeed Lilith in disguise, then her visit to Jerusalem takes on an entirely different character. She wasn't coming to honor Solomon or to learn from his wisdom. She was conducting reconnaissance on the most powerful human practitioner of divine magic in the world. She was studying his methods, testing his defenses, and preparing for a confrontation that would echo through eternity. The ancient texts describe how Lilith possessed supernatural beauty that could entrance even the wisest of men. Her intelligence was not merely human cleverness, but demonic cunning refined over millennia of rebellion against the divine order. When she stood before Solomon in his throne room, surrounded by the glory of his kingdom, she was not just a foreign queen paying homage. She was a predator evaluating her prey. But Solomon was no ordinary king. The Lord had granted him wisdom beyond human measure, and with that wisdom came the ability to perceive spiritual realities hidden from normal sight. The Testament of Solomon, a mystical text that details the king's mastery over demonic forces, reveals that Solomon possessed a magical ring inscribed with divine names that gave him authority over all supernatural entities. This ring, gifted to him by the archangel Michael, was the source of his power to bind demons and compel their service in building the great temple. When the Queen of Sheba arrived in Jerusalem with her riddles and her tests, she was unknowingly walking into the presence of the one human being on earth who possessed the authority to see through her disguise and expose her true nature. The tension in that throne room must have been electric as two of the most powerful beings in existence faced each other, each testing the other's strength and resolve. The riddles she posed to Solomon were not innocent intellectual puzzles. According to the mystical traditions, they were words of seduction and corruption, echoes of the same temptations that Lilith had whispered to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Each question was designed not just to challenge Solomon's understanding, but to plant seeds of doubt and pride that might eventually grow into spiritual compromise. Yet Solomon, protected by divine wisdom and armed with supernatural authority, saw through her deceptions. The moment he recognized her true identity, the dynamic of their encounter shifted dramatically. No longer was this a meeting between equals. This was a confrontation between a servant of the Most High and a rebel against divine order. The outcome was never truly in doubt, but the consequences would reverberate through both their destinies. The texts describe how Solomon's divine insight allowed him to perceive the demonic nature hidden beneath the queen's human appearance. Some accounts speak of him noticing her animal-like legs, a telltale sign of her supernatural origin. Others describe how her shadow fell wrong, or how her reflection revealed her true form. Whatever the specific details, the moment of recognition marked the beginning of the end of her freedom. Using the power of his ring and the authority granted to him by heaven, Solomon bound the demon queen just as he had bound countless other supernatural entities. But her binding was different from the others. Where lesser demons were simply compelled to perform manual labor in service of the temple construction, the Queen of Sheba represented a unique challenge and opportunity. Her intelligence, her beauty, and her vast supernatural knowledge made her too valuable to simply relegate to hauling stones or mixing mortar. Instead, Solomon assigned her to tasks that would make use of her particular talents, while ensuring her complete subjugation to his will. Some traditions suggest she was forced to use her shape-shifting abilities to infiltrate enemy kingdoms and gather intelligence for Israel. Others describe her being compelled to reveal the secrets of supernatural wisdom that she had accumulated over millennia of existence. Still others hint at darker purposes, suggesting that Solomon used her demonic nature to strengthen his own magical abilities and deepen his understanding of the spiritual realms. But binding a demon of such power and cunning was not without risks. Every day that the Queen of Sheba remained in Solomon's service, she was studying him just as intently as he had once studied her. She was learning the patterns of his thought, the sources of his strength, and most importantly, the potential weaknesses in his spiritual armor. Demons, after all, are patient creatures. They think in terms of centuries and millennia, not months and years. What appeared to be complete submission might actually be careful preparation for eventual revenge. The relationship between Solomon and his bound demon queen became one of the most complex and dangerous dynamics in his court. She was simultaneously his greatest asset and his greatest threat, a source of supernatural knowledge and a constant temptation towards spiritual compromise. Her presence in Jerusalem marked the beginning of a gradual shift in Solomon's reign, a subtle turning away from pure devotion to the Lord toward a more pragmatic approach to power that would eventually prove to be his undoing. As we delve deeper into this forbidden's history, we begin to understand that the Queen of Sheba's transformation from visiting dignitary to bound demon was not just a personal tragedy. It was a cosmic event that would have far-reaching consequences for Solomon's kingdom, for the spiritual realm, and for the ultimate fate of both the king and his supernatural prisoner. The ancient texts whisper of the years that followed, when Solomon's wisdom began to be corrupted by his constant exposure to demonic influence, when his pure heart started to be divided between the Lord who had blessed him and the supernatural forces he commanded. They speak of late nights in the palace when the bound demon queen would whisper secrets of forbidden knowledge, slowly poisoning the king's mind with pride and ambition that went beyond what heaven had ordained. But perhaps most disturbing of all, these texts hint at what happened when Solomon's power finally began to wane, when his spiritual defenses started to crumble, and when the carefully maintained bonds that held his supernatural prisoners began to weaken. For if there is one thing that demons never forget, it is the taste of freedom and the burning desire for revenge against those who have held them captive. The true fate of Solomon's demon queen after her fall from grace is a story that encompasses binding and rebellion, wisdom and corruption, divine justice and supernatural vengeance. It is a tale that reveals the hidden spiritual dynamics that shaped one of the most glorious and tragic reigns in biblical history. And it carries warnings that echo down through the centuries to our own time. The binding of the demon queen created ripples throughout the supernatural realm that Solomon could never have anticipated. While he believed he had achieved total dominion over one of the most powerful entities in existence, the reality was far more complex and dangerous than his human mind could comprehend. The Testament of Solomon reveals that demons possess a hierarchy and loyalty system that transcends individual captivity, and by binding their queen, Solomon had essentially declared war on forces he didn't fully understand. Night after night, as Solomon slept in his magnificent palace, believing himself secure in his divine protection, the bound demon queen was communicating with her supernatural allies through methods that no human magic could detect. The very air around Jerusalem began to thicken with malevolent presence as other demonic entities gathered in the spiritual realm, drawn by their queen's captivity and plotting her eventual liberation. These weren't merely lesser demons responding to their sovereign's plight. These were ancient powers that had ruled in darkness since before human civilization began. The queen's true genius lay not in her obvious supernatural abilities, but in her understanding of human psychology. During her years of forced servitude in Solomon's court, she carefully studied not just the king, but everyone around him. She observed the patterns of his advisors, the weaknesses of his guards, the ambitions of his wives, and most crucially, the gradual changes in Solomon's own character as power and success began to corrupt his once pure heart. What Solomon failed to recognize was that binding a demon doesn't eliminate their fundamental nature. It merely constrains their actions while leaving their essence unchanged. The Queen of Sheba, even in her subjugated state, remained a master manipulator whose very presence in the palace was slowly poisoning the spiritual atmosphere. Every conversation she was forced to have, every task she was compelled to perform, every moment of apparent obedience was actually part of a larger strategy to undermine the foundations of Solomon's kingdom from within. The ancient texts describe how she began to influence Solomon through seemingly innocent observations and suggestions. When foreign dignitaries visited the court, She would whisper insights about their cultures and customs that proved remarkably accurate and useful. When construction challenges arose during the temple building, she would propose solutions that demonstrated profound architectural understanding. When political dilemmas threatened the stability of the kingdom, her counsel often provided exactly the wisdom Solomon needed to navigate complex situations. But each piece of helpful advice came with a subtle cost. Each demonstration of her supernatural knowledge made Solomon more dependent on her insights and less reliant on seeking divine guidance through prayer and meditation. The pattern was so gradual and the benefits so apparent that Solomon never recognized he was being slowly weaned away from his relationship with the Lord and toward an unhealthy dependence on demonic wisdom. The demon queen's greatest weapon was patience. She understood that Solomon's downfall would not come through dramatic confrontation, but through incremental compromise. She began to plant questions in his mind about the limitations of divine revelation. Why should he confine himself to seeking God's will through traditional channels, when he had access to supernatural knowledge that could provide immediate answers to any question? Why should he limit his understanding to human wisdom when demonic insight could unlock mysteries that had puzzled scholars for generations? These whispered doubts found fertile ground in Solomon's increasingly prideful heart. The king, who had once humbly asked God for wisdom to govern his people, began to believe that his accumulated knowledge and supernatural resources made him nearly equal to divinity itself. The demon queen watched this transformation with satisfaction, knowing that pride had been the downfall of countless righteous souls throughout history. Meanwhile, the supernatural realm was mobilizing for a coordinated assault on Solomon's defenses. The binding of their queen had united various demonic factions that had previously been rivals or enemies. Ancient powers that had not worked together since the earliest days of creation now found common cause in their desire to free their sovereign and exact revenge on the human king who had dared to enslave her. The mystical traditions speak of a growing darkness that began to settle over Jerusalem during this period. Strange omens appeared in the sky. Animals behaved erratically. Dreams throughout the city became filled with disturbing visions. The spiritual sensitive among Solomon's subjects began to sense that something fundamental was shifting in the cosmic order, though they could not identify the source of their unease. But perhaps the most significant change was occurring within Solomon himself. The constant exposure to demonic influence was gradually altering his spiritual perception. The pure wisdom that had once flowed from his connection to the divine was becoming contaminated with supernatural knowledge that carried hidden costs. His famous judgment and discernment remained sharp, but they were increasingly guided by pragmatic calculation rather than divine inspiration. The Queen of Sheba could see these changes more clearly than anyone else in the court. Her supernatural senses allowed her to perceive the gradual dimming of the divine light that had once blazed so brightly around Solomon. She watched as his prayers became more perfunctory and his reliance on supernatural shortcuts increased. Most importantly, she observed how his relationships with his many foreign wives were beginning to take precedence over his covenant relationship with the Lord. This shift in Solomon's priorities created the opening she had been patiently waiting for. The king's growing fascination with foreign cultures and religions, encouraged by his wives and subtly reinforced by her own carefully planted suggestions, was leading him toward the very spiritual compromise that would ultimately break the divine protection that kept her bound. The demon queen understood something that Solomon had forgotten: his pride in success. The power that held her captive was not ultimately his own, but was derived from his relationship with the Most High. As that relationship weakened through neglect and compromise, the supernatural bonds that constrained her would inevitably begin to weaken as well. All she needed to do was continue her patient work of corruption, while her allies in the spiritual realm prepared for the moment when her chains would finally shatter. The irony was profound and terrible. Solomon, in his desire to master the supernatural realm, had brought into his very household the instrument of his own destruction. The demon queen he believed he had conquered was actually conquering him. One whispered suggestion at a time, one compromised decision at a time, one step away from divine favor at a time. As the years passed and Solomon's spiritual condition continued to deteriorate, strange reports began to reach the palace from the far corners of his kingdom. Mysterious figures were being seen in remote areas, beings of supernatural power who seemed to be gathering intelligence and making preparations for some unknown purpose. These weren't the usual demons that plagued isolated communities. These were organized, purposeful entities who moved with military precision and appeared to be following a coordinated plan. The demon queen, still bound but increasingly aware of her approaching liberation, began to exhibit subtle signs of anticipation that only the most spiritually discerning observers might have noticed. Her compliance remained perfect. Her service continued without apparent reluctance, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was no longer truly present in her captivity. Her consciousness seemed to be elsewhere, perhaps communing with the gathering forces that would soon attempt her rescue. Solomon, increasingly absorbed in his building projects, his diplomatic achievements, and his expanding collection of foreign wives, failed to recognize the signs of the approaching storm. The divine wisdom that had once made him sensitive to spiritual realities had been clouded by years of compromise and supernatural contamination. He continued to believe that his mastery over the demon queen was absolute and permanent, never suspecting that he was actually living on borrowed time. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of the bound demon queen, but the ultimate destiny of Solomon's kingdom, and perhaps the balance of power in the spiritual realm itself. Forces were aligning, plans were being finalized, and the patient work of corruption that had been proceeding in shadows for years was approaching its climactic moment. But the true horror of what was coming was not just the prospect of the demon queen's liberation. It was the realization that her years of captivity had not been wasted time, but had been a period of intensive preparation. She had used her forced proximity to Solomon to study not just his weaknesses, but the entire structure of divine authority that governed the relationship between heaven and earth. When she finally broke free, she would not be returning to her previous state of power. She would be emerging as something far more dangerous than she had ever been before. The mystical texts speak of a period when the very fabric of reality began to bend under the weight of supernatural tension building around Jerusalem. As Solomon's spiritual defenses weakened through years of compromise and divided loyalties, the demon queen's allies in the shadow realm were preparing for an assault that would test the boundaries between the divine and the infernal. What they were planning was not merely a rescue mission, but a complete reversal of the cosmic order that allowed a human king to bind and command the queen of demons. The Testament of Solomon reveals that during this critical period, other powerful demons under Solomon's control began to exhibit signs of restlessness. Asmodeus, the king of demons who had been forced to oversee much of the temple construction, started to demonstrate subtle acts of defiance that suggested the binding spells were losing their effectiveness. Orneus, the demon who had first brought Solomon to the attention of the archangel Michael, began to appear in the dreams of palace servants, planting seeds of doubt about their king's righteousness. But most disturbing of all, Anosculus, the female demon with the form of a beautiful woman and the legs of a mule, began to be seen wandering the palace corridors at night, despite supposedly being bound to her spinning wheel. These weren't random occurrences of supernatural rebellion. They were coordinated probes designed to test the strength of Solomon's magical defenses and identify the optimal moment for a full-scale assault. The demon queen, even in her bound state, was serving as a communication hub for these entities, her consciousness reaching out through dimensions that human magic could not monitor or control. Every night brought new intelligence about Solomon's weakening condition. Every dawn revealed fresh opportunities for exploitation. The king himself remained oblivious to the gathering storm, his attention increasingly consumed by the intoxicating presence of his foreign wives and their exotic religious practices. The woman from Sheba had been right to wait and watch, for Solomon's heart was indeed turning away from the pure devotion that had once made him untouchable to demonic influence. His growing fascination with the gods of his wives created spiritual vulnerabilities that centuries of demonic patience had been waiting to exploit. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this developing crisis was the transformation occurring within the demon queen herself. The ancient texts hint that her years of forced proximity to divine power had not simply been a period of suffering and humiliation. They had been a time of learning and adaptation. She had absorbed knowledge about the operation of divine authority that no demon had ever possessed before. She had studied the mechanisms by which heaven maintained order over the supernatural realm. Most dangerously of all, she had begun to understand how those mechanisms might be subverted or corrupted. The Kabbalistic traditions speak of this period as the time when Lilith learned to mimic the voice of divine authority itself. Through her careful observation of Solomon's interactions with heavenly messengers and her analysis of the sacred formulas he used to command demons, she began to develop the ability to counterfeit the very power that held her captive. This was not mere shape-shifting or illusion. This was a fundamental corruption of spiritual authority that threatened to upset the cosmic balance between light and darkness. As Solomon's kingdom reached the height of its earthly glory, with trade routes spanning continents and diplomatic relationships extending to the furthest reaches of the known world, the spiritual foundations of his power were crumbling beneath him. The demon queen could sense the approaching moment of her liberation with an anticipation that had been building for decades. Every compromise Solomon made, every step away from divine favor, every night spent in the arms of foreign wives who whispered of their native gods, brought her closer to freedom. The breaking point came not through dramatic supernatural confrontation, but through the quiet erosion of moral authority that had been Solomon's true source of power. When he began to participate in the worship of foreign deities, when he allowed altars to be built for gods whose very names were abominations before the Lord, when he chose the temporary pleasures of political expediency over the eternal principles of divine covenant, the magical bonds that held his supernatural prisoners began to dissolve like morning mist before the rising sun. The demon queen felt the change immediately. The spiritual chains that had held her for so many years suddenly became as fragile as spider webs. The divine names inscribed on Solomon's ring, which had once blazed with heavenly authority, now flickered with uncertain light. The moment she had been waiting for with infinite patience had finally arrived, and she was ready to seize it with all the fury and cunning that centuries of captivity had refined to a razor's edge. But her liberation would not be a simple matter of breaking free from physical bonds. The mystical traditions reveal that her time in Solomon's court had fundamentally changed her nature and her ambitions. She was no longer content to simply escape and return to her previous existence as a powerful but ultimately limited demonic entity. Her exposure to the inner workings of divine authority had given her far grander aspirations. She now sought nothing less than to usurp the very power that had once held her captive. The ancient texts describe the night of her escape as one of the most terrifying supernatural events in recorded history. As Solomon lay sleeping, his consciousness clouded by wine and corrupted by years of spiritual compromise, the demon queen finally shattered the weakened bonds that had held her. But instead of fleeing immediately, she remained in the palace for several crucial hours, using her newfound freedom to systematically corrupt or destroy the magical protections that Solomon had spent decades building around his kingdom. Working with supernatural speed and precision, she began to unravel the spiritual defenses that had made Jerusalem a fortress against demonic influence. Sacred symbols were defiled, protective wards were reversed, and the very air around the palace began to thicken with malevolent presence as other demons sensed their queen's liberation and rushed to join her. By dawn, the spiritual atmosphere of the holy city had been fundamentally altered, transformed from a beacon of divine light into something far more ambiguous and dangerous. When Solomon finally awakened to discover what had transpired, He found himself facing not just the loss of a powerful supernatural servant, but the complete collapse of the magical system that had supported his reign. The Demon Queen had not simply escaped. She had systematically dismantled the supernatural architecture of his kingdom, leaving him vulnerable to forces he had previously commanded with absolute authority. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that she had not acted alone. The other demons that Solomon had bound over the years had been quietly coordinating their own escapes, using the chaos of their queen's liberation to break free from their own constraints. Asmodeus, Orneus, Oniscellus, and dozens of other supernatural entities suddenly found themselves unbound and free to pursue their own agendas of revenge against the king who had enslaved them. The palace that had once been a center of divine wisdom and supernatural order was transformed overnight into a battleground, where competing demonic factions vied for influence over the increasingly confused and spiritually weakened Solomon. The king who had once commanded demons with absolute authority now found himself at the mercy of beings whose hatred had been refined by years of enforced servitude. Yet the Demon Queen's ultimate revenge was not to be found in direct confrontation with her former captor. Her true masterpiece was far more subtle and devastating. She had spent her years of captivity carefully studying not just Solomon's weaknesses, but the entire structure of his kingdom. She understood the political tensions that held his realm together, the economic relationships that sustained his power, and most importantly, the spiritual dynamics that had made his reign possible in the first place. With surgical precision, she began to exploit every vulnerability she had identified. Foreign kingdoms that had been peaceful trading partners suddenly became hostile enemies. Domestic political factions that had previously supported Solomon's rule began to question his judgment and rebel against his authority. The very wives whose influence had contributed to his spiritual downfall now became instruments of political chaos as their competing religious loyalties fractured the unity of the royal court. The Demon Queen had learned during her captivity that the most effective form of revenge was not the dramatic destruction of an enemy, but the slow, methodical corruption of everything they held dear. Solomon's kingdom, his wisdom, his relationships, his spiritual authority, his very identity as the chosen of the Lord, all became targets in a campaign of supernatural warfare that operated through seemingly natural political and social mechanisms. As the kingdom began to fragment and Solomon's power waned, the Demon Queen established herself not as a visible ruler, but as a hidden influence that shaped events from the shadows. She had learned from her years of observation that true power was often most effective when it remained invisible, working through human agents who believed they were acting according to their own free will. The transformation was complete. The Queen of Sheba had evolved from a visiting dignitary to a bound demon to something far more dangerous than either of her previous incarnations. She had become a master of spiritual corruption who understood both divine and infernal authority well enough to manipulate the balance between them for her own purposes. Her fall from grace had become a rise to a form of power that was more sophisticated and threatening than anything she had possessed before. And as Solomon's reign crumbled around him, as his wisdom turned to folly and his strength became weakness, the Demon Queen watched from the shadows with satisfaction. Her patient endurance of captivity had not been mere suffering, but preparation for a form of revenge that would echo through the generations. She had not simply escaped from bondage. She had transformed bondage itself into a tool of conquest, using her time as a prisoner to become something far more dangerous than she had ever been as a free demon. The true horror of her fate after the fall was not that she had been destroyed or permanently bound, but that she had used her apparent defeat as a stepping stone to a victory more complete and terrible than any she had previously imagined. The wisest king who ever lived had unknowingly trained his own destroyer, and the consequences of that training would reshape the spiritual landscape for centuries to come. The ancient texts speak of what happened next with hushed reverence and barely contained terror. As Solomon's kingdom descended into chaos and his spiritual authority crumbled, the demon queen began to reveal the true scope of what she had accomplished during her years of seeming captivity. What the court had witnessed was not merely the escape of a powerful supernatural entity, but the emergence of something entirely new in the cosmic order. She had become a hybrid being, possessing both the ancient cunning of demonkind and an intimate understanding of divine mechanics that no fallen creature had ever obtained before. The mystical traditions describe how she established what can only be called a shadow kingdom, a parallel structure of power that operated alongside and often in direct opposition to the earthly governments of the region. This was not a physical realm, but a network of influence that extended through dimensions, both seen and unseen. From her hidden throne, she began to orchestrate events across multiple kingdoms simultaneously, using her supernatural abilities to manipulate human affairs on a scale that defied comprehension. Her first major act of revenge was not directed at Solomon personally, but at the very concept of divine kingship that he represented. She began to systematically corrupt other rulers throughout the ancient world, appearing to them in dreams and visions disguised as divine messengers. Her years of studying Solomon's relationship with heavenly authority had taught her exactly how to counterfeit the voice of divine guidance, and she used this knowledge to lead king after king into the same spiritual traps that had ensnared her former captor. The Kabbalistic writings hint that during this period, the demon queen developed what they call the Great Deception. This was not simply another form of supernatural trickery, but a comprehensive system for corrupting divine revelation itself. She learned to intercept prayers before they reached heaven, to plant false visions in the minds of prophets, and to twist sacred dreams into instruments of spiritual destruction. The very channels through which the divine communicated with humanity became compromised by her influence. But her masterpiece of corruption was reserved for Solomon himself. Rather than destroying him outright, which would have been a relatively simple matter given his weakened spiritual condition, she chose instead to transform him into a living demonstration of her power. She began to appear to him regularly, no longer as a bound servant, but as a seductive advisor who claimed to offer him the keys to recovering his lost authority and wisdom. The encounters between them during this period represent some of the most psychologically complex supernatural interactions recorded in mystical literature. Solomon, desperate to regain his former glory and tormented by the knowledge of how far he had fallen, found himself increasingly dependent on the very entity he had once commanded. The demon queen played upon his pride, his regret, and his lingering desire for supernatural knowledge with the skill of a master manipulator who had spent decades studying his psychological weaknesses. She offered him new forms of magic that promised to restore his power, but each ritual she taught him bound him more completely to her will. She revealed secrets of supernatural wisdom that seemed to enhance his understanding, but every revelation came with hidden costs that eroded his connection to divine truth. Most insidiously, she presented herself as his only remaining ally in a world that had turned against him, gradually isolating him from every other source of support or guidance. The ancient texts describe how Solomon's appearance began to change during this period of supernatural manipulation. The divine radiance that had once emanated from his presence dimmed to a flickering shadow. His famous wisdom became increasingly erratic, brilliant one moment and foolish the next. His physical form began to show signs of premature aging as the demonic influence consumed his vitality from within. Yet he remained convinced that his alliance with the demon queen was his path back to greatness. What Solomon failed to understand was that he had become not her partner, but her primary experiment in the art of corrupting divine authority. Every technique she tested on him, every method of spiritual manipulation she perfected through their interactions, was being cataloged and refined for use against other servants of the Most High. He had become a laboratory specimen in her research into the systematic corruption of righteousness. The demon queen's influence began to extend beyond individual manipulation to affect the very fabric of spiritual reality in the region. The boundaries between the divine and infernal realms, which had been clearly defined since the foundation of the world, began to blur in ways that created dangerous ambiguities. Prophets found their visions contaminated with demonic imagery. Priests discovered that their rituals sometimes produced effects that seemed divine but carried subtle corruptions. The faithful began to experience spiritual phenomena that defied traditional categories of good and evil. This period marked the emergence of what mystical scholars would later call the Twilight Authority, a form of spiritual power that drew from both divine and infernal sources simultaneously. The Demon Queen had learned to create spiritual hybrid vigor by combining opposing energies in ways that amplified their effects while obscuring their true nature. This represented a fundamental innovation in supernatural warfare that would influence occult practices for millennia to come. Meanwhile, the other demons who had escaped during the collapse of Solomon's binding system were establishing their own domains of influence throughout the ancient world. But unlike their queen, they remained bound by their original natures and limitations. They could terrorize, possess, and corrupt, but they lacked her sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate the deeper structures of spiritual authority. This created a hierarchy within the demonic realm that placed her at the apex of a new order of supernatural power. The fallen angels who had rebelled against heaven in the primordial ages found themselves confronted with a being who had achieved something they had never managed. Where they had been cast down and confined to specific roles and limitations, she had found a way to transcend the boundaries that constrained demonic existence. Her transformation from bound prisoner to Shadow Empress represented an evolution in the nature of evil itself. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her new existence was the way she began to recruit human agents who served her willingly rather than through coercion or possession. These were individuals who were drawn to the sophisticated blend of wisdom and power that she offered. People who believed they were advancing their own interests while actually furthering her agenda of cosmic subversion. She had learned that voluntary cooperation was far more effective than supernatural compulsion for achieving long-term objectives. These human servants were not the usual cultists or demon worshippers found in other supernatural traditions. They were often respected members of their communities, scholars, merchants, political leaders, and even religious figures who had been gradually drawn into her web through seemingly innocent encounters. She had perfected the art of corrupting good intentions, turning virtuous desires for knowledge, prosperity, and influence into pathways towards spiritual destruction. The network of influence that grew around her became known in the mystical texts as the Hidden Kingdom, a shadow government that operated parallel to earthly political structures while pursuing an agenda that transcended human understanding. This was not merely another demonic cult, but a sophisticated system for gradually reshaping the spiritual landscape of the ancient world according to her vision of corrupted order. As her power grew and her influence spread, the Demon Queen began to reveal aspects of her ultimate purpose that chilled even the most hardened scholars of supernatural lore. Her goal was not simply revenge against Solomon or dominion over human affairs. She was working toward nothing less than a complete inversion of the cosmic order itself, a reality where divine and infernal authorities would be so intertwined and confused that the very concepts of good and evil would lose their meaning. The ancient prophecies speak of a time when this great work of corruption would reach its culmination, when the boundaries between heaven and hell would collapse entirely, and a new form of existence would emerge from the chaos. The Demon Queen saw herself as the architect of this transformation, the bridge between opposing realms who would ultimately transcend both divine and infernal limitations to become something unprecedented in the history of creation. But the texts also hint that her grand design contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The very ambition that had driven her to transcend the normal constraints of demonic existence would eventually lead her into a confrontation with forces that no single entity, however powerful or cunning, could hope to overcome. The cosmic balance that she sought to overthrow was maintained not by arbitrary divine decree, but by fundamental principles woven into the very structure of reality itself. Her fate after the fall was not to be a simple story of escape and revenge, but a complex tragedy of overreach and ultimate judgment. The power she had gained through her transformation would become both her greatest weapon and her final vulnerability, setting her on a collision course with divine justice that would determine not only her own destiny, but the spiritual fate of countless souls who had become entangled in her web of corruption. The stage was being set for a final confrontation that would test the very foundations of spiritual authority and determine whether the ancient order established by divine decree could withstand the sophisticated challenge posed by a being who had learned to corrupt the mechanisms of cosmic justice themselves. What happened next would reshape not only the supernatural realm, but the entire relationship between heaven, earth, and the shadowy spaces that lie between them. The final confrontation began not with thunderous, supernatural warfare, but with a whisper in the deepest chambers of Solomon's crumbling palace. As the once mighty king sat alone in his throne room, surrounded by the fading glory of his diminished kingdom, the demon queen materialized before him one last time. But she no longer appeared as the bound servant he had once commanded, or even as the seductive advisor who had guided his recent downfall. Instead, she stood revealed in her true form, a being that defied every category of existence that human language could express. Her appearance was simultaneously beautiful and terrible, divine and infernal, familiar and utterly alien. The years of absorbing both heavenly and demonic energies had transformed her into something that transcended the normal boundaries of spiritual classification. She radiated an authority that seemed to rival heaven itself, yet carried within it the unmistakable taint of primordial rebellion. Solomon, looking upon her with eyes dimmed by decades of spiritual compromise, could barely comprehend what his former prisoner had become. "Behold what your wisdom has wrought," she spoke with a voice that echoed across dimensions, carrying harmonics that resonated in both celestial and infernal frequencies. "You sought to bind the queen of demons, yet you have created something far more dangerous than anything that existed before your meddling. Through your pride and your folly, you have given birth to a new order of being, one that understands both the language of angels and the whispers of the abyss." The revelation struck Solomon with the force of divine judgment. He realized in that moment that his entire relationship with the supernatural realm had been orchestrated from the beginning. The demon queen had not simply been waiting for an opportunity to escape. She had been actively guiding events toward this precise outcome, using her apparent captivity as a means of education and transformation that would elevate her beyond anything she could have achieved through traditional demonic rebellion. But even as she stood triumphant before her former captor, the cosmic mechanisms that governed spiritual reality were already responding to the unprecedented disruption she represented. The very fabric of creation began to vibrate with tension as heaven itself took notice of what had emerged from the shadows of Solomon's court. The archangels who had once granted Solomon his ring of power now turned their attention toward the hybrid entity that threatened to upset the eternal balance between light and darkness. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, but a convergence of spiritual forces that tested the fundamental laws governing existence itself. The demon queen found herself caught between the divine authorities she had learned to counterfeit and the infernal powers she had transcended. Her sophisticated understanding of both realms, which had been her greatest strength, now became a liability as she discovered that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed, even by beings of her evolved nature. The ancient texts describe how reality itself began to reject her presence, creating paradoxes and contradictions that even her enhanced abilities could not resolve. She had become too divine for hell to contain her, and too corrupted for heaven to accept her. The twilight realm she had carved out between the two began to collapse under the weight of its own impossibility, trapping her in a prison far more complete than any Solomon had ever devised. As the supernatural architecture she had constructed crumbled around her, The demon queen experienced something that no being of her kind had ever endured: true isolation. She had transcended every category of existence only to discover that transcendence without divine sanction was merely another form of exile. The network of influence she had built across the ancient world began to unravel as the hybrid energies that sustained it proved unstable without her direct presence to maintain their delicate balance. Her human agents, suddenly cut off from the sophisticated spiritual guidance they had grown dependent upon, found themselves adrift in a reality that no longer made sense according to the corrupted wisdom she had taught them. Many descended into madness as their minds struggled to process the contradictions embedded in their worldview. Others simply forgot their supernatural experiences entirely, their consciousness rejecting memories that could not be reconciled with normal human existence. Solomon himself was among the casualties of this cosmic readjustment. The king who had once possessed wisdom beyond mortal understanding found his mind shattered by the revelation of how completely he had been manipulated. The divine gifts that had made him the greatest ruler in human history were withdrawn not as punishment, but as mercy, preventing him from fully comprehending the magnitude of what his pride had unleashed upon the world. Yet even in her final downfall, the demon queen's influence persisted in ways that would echo through the centuries. The techniques of spiritual corruption she had pioneered, the methods of counterfeiting divine authority she had perfected, the very concept of transcending traditional supernatural boundaries, all became part of the hidden knowledge that would be passed down through generations of occult practitioners and mystical rebels. The Kabbalistic traditions speak of her ultimate fate with a mixture of awe and horror. She was not destroyed, for beings of her evolved nature had moved beyond the possibility of simple annihilation. Neither was she returned to her original state, for the transformation she had undergone could not be undone. Instead, she was sealed away in what the texts call the void between voices, a realm of absolute silence where neither divine praise nor infernal rebellion could exist. In this place of ultimate isolation, she remains to this day, conscious but unable to act, aware but unable to influence, possessing vast knowledge but denied any means of applying it. Her existence has become a living demonstration of the truth that some forms of transcendence are indistinguishable from the most complete forms of imprisonment. She achieved everything she had sought and discovered that achievement itself could become the most perfect form of punishment. The legacy of Solomon's demon queen served as an eternal warning about the dangers of spiritual ambition divorced from divine submission. Her story reveals that wisdom without humility leads to corruption, that power without righteousness breeds destruction, and that the desire to transcend divinely ordained boundaries ultimately results in a fall more complete than any simple rebellion could achieve. As we close this dark chapter of hidden history, we are left with questions that pierce the very heart of human spiritual ambition. How many of us in our desire for knowledge and power are walking the same path that led Solomon to his downfall? How many of us are being influenced by forces that present themselves as wisdom, but carry within them the seeds of our destruction? And most importantly, how can we guard our hearts against the subtle corruptions that transform our highest aspirations into instruments of our own judgment? The demon queen's fate reminds us that the spiritual realm operates according to laws far more complex and unforgiving than we often realize. It warns us that every compromise with darkness, no matter how small or seemingly beneficial, carries consequences that extend far beyond our ability to predict or control. And it teaches us that true wisdom begins not with the accumulation of supernatural knowledge, but with the recognition of our absolute dependence upon divine grace. In the end, the shocking truth about Solomon's demon queen is not just her transformation from visiting dignitary to bound servant to transcendent threat, but the revelation that her entire story serves as a mirror reflecting our own spiritual condition. We too are caught between divine calling and demonic temptation. We too must choose between the humble wisdom that comes from above and the prideful knowledge that promises to make us like gods. And we too will face the consequences of our choices, whether those consequences lead to redemption or to a fate as terrible and complete as the one that befell the queen who dared to challenge the very foundations of spiritual reality itself. The ancient texts preserve her story not to satisfy our curiosity about supernatural mysteries, but to warn us about the dangers that await any soul that seeks to transcend the boundaries God has established for our protection. Her fall teaches us that the greatest victories of evil often come disguised as spiritual achievement, and that the most complete forms of judgment sometimes appear indistinguishable from the fulfillment of our deepest ambitions. May we learn from her fate and choose the path of humble obedience over the illusion of transcendent rebellion. For in the end, the only true freedom is found in submission to divine authority, and the only lasting wisdom comes from recognizing that we are creatures, not creators, in the grand design of existence that stretches from the foundations of the world to the ultimate restoration of all things under heaven's eternal reign.